Buenos dias. I was told the whole lecture here in Iowa is in Spanish. So honored to be here, first Monday's lecture series. I want to thank Dr. Henriksen, and I want to thank Dort, and I want to thank Emily Rowe, who's a living embodiment of Luke chapter 18. For those of you who do not recall Luke 18 is where Jesus taught them the parable of how to pray without ceasing. He does it by highlighting a woman that kept knocking at the door, even though the judge would not answer. In case you're wondering, I am the one who doesn't answer, and Bishop Emily Rowe is the one who continues to knock. I want to underscore for you that what you may already know, and so if you already know, forgive my repeating. You're in the middle of Hispanic Heritage Month here in the United States of America. Hispanic Heritage Month is that great month between September 15th and October 15th, that month. It begins on September 15th because in that week, more than 7 Latin American countries declare their independence. And it ends the week of October 15th, which is October, that second Monday in October is what most people call Columbus Day, and what some Latin Americans and U.S.-born Hispanics call Día de la Resistencia Indígena, Day of the Indigenous Resistance. It's interesting that for two groups of people, the same day can mean radically different things. And I want to talk to you about optics, about lenses, and how we see this moment in American history. ¿En qué momento estamos viviendo? What moment are we living it? I want to phrase it with a question of that famous prophet of American culture, Marvin Gaye. What's going on? If you are going to speak with clarity into a moment, and if you're going to bring a gospel ethic or a gospel optic, it assumes that you understand the moment. It assumes that you and I are like the children of Issachar, Benai Yishachar. 1 Chronicles 12:32 says, it begins to list the tribes of the nation of Israel, of the Benai Yisrael. And it says something particular about the children of Issachar. It says that the children of Issachar were different in these two ways. Number one, they understood the times. Number two, they knew what Israel ought to do. And so as I speak to you beyond despair, I found this, I cement this, I ground this in the understanding that you and I can have an understanding of the times, number one. But once we have an understanding of the times we're living in America, I do not pretend to speak for the world. I do not pretend to speak for America. I do not pretend to speak for the 57 million Latinos living in the United States. 1 out of every 6 children born in the United States is Hispanic. 57 million if you count Puerto Rico. 50.4 million if you don't count Puerto Rico. I do not pretend to speak for all these people, but it's not just knowing what's going on. It's what we ought to do. In ethic, it's called oughtness. What time is it? And what is the Christian oughtness of the moment? How should Christians respond to what's going on? And so let me tell you how certain people see this time in America. As I began, I said that on October, it is Columbus Day and Día de la Resistencia Indígena, or Día de la Raza. Both things happening simultaneously. So I submit to you that not all of us see America the same way. Not all of us experience the moment the same way. And certainly not all of us define it in the same way. But perhaps, sisters and brothers, hermanos y hermanas, the gospel can give a better clarity what time we're living. And so for some of us, when you ask us, what time is it in America? We respond like Mr. Tumnus from Chronicles of Narnia. You remember him. They asked him, what time is it in Narnia? And Tumnus answers, it is winter in Narnia. Let me just say, I flew in here from Orlando, Florida. Thank you for your empathy. I feel that Christian compassion and solidarity. It's not winter here, but when you fly from Orlando, oh boy, is it winter. Optics, experiences. The Germans call it Sitz and Leben, where you sit in the world, your social location. Mr. Tumnus says, it is winter, es invierno en Narnia, and has been for ever so long. Now listen to what he says next. Always winter, but never Christmas. Mr. Tumnus is having a Chicken Little moment. The sky is falling. He sees things through a dystopic lens. He sees things, and rightfully so, the winter witch is on the move. It seems that Aslan is retreating. And for many evangelicals in America, and let me be clear, I self-identify as an evangelical, they feel in November, or a little before November of 2015, after the Obergefell decision in the Supreme Court. A Chicken Little moment defined by writers like Michael Gerson and Peter Werner on the cover of Christianity Today in November. We lost the decision to Obergefell was their optic, and that was the Chicken Little moment. But me as a brown evangelical, as a Latino evangelical, as a hybrid, when I come to places and I tell people I am Latino and they don't say anything else about me, they assume I'm a Democrat. When I come to places and I say I am an evangelical and they say nothing else about me, they assume I'm a Republican. But then when I say I am a Latino evangelical, they don't know what to do. I'm not confused. I'm integrated. Like Mr. Tumnus, half human, half fawn, fully embodying the totality of who I am. I did not decide to be Latino. It was not a decision. God, in God's sovereignty, placed me in a Hispanic family because God understood that from that place, I had a contribution to make to the larger world. Grew up in an evangelical family. And it is from these two places that I understand the moment in America. And not just I, but the close to 7 million Hispanic evangelicals living in the United States. There are more Hispanic evangelicals living in the United States than there are Hispanics living in Paraguay. And for us, the question that Michael Gerson and Peter Werner, when they began to define this as the winter of their discontent, to paraphrase Shakespeare, as winter but never Christmas, to paraphrase C.S. Lewis in the Chronicles of Narnia, nosotros nos preguntamos, we asked ourselves, why is this winter? Why is this the Chicken Little moment? Why is this the moment of despair, enemy, and alienation for my brothers and sisters in evangelicalism in America? Was slavery a Chicken Little moment for them? Was women's disenfranchisement a Chicken Little moment for them? Was the internment of Chinese men and women during the Second World War a Chicken Little for them? Was when refugees from the Middle East fleeing civil war, or refugees from Latin America fleeing violence in Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Guatemala, was that the chicken? Why is the Chicken Little moment Obergefell? And not when tens of thousands of children fleeing violence from the Mara Salvatrucha, the Chicken Little moment? What time is it in America? And what is it that drives many of us to a summary of a clash of civilizations? I submit to you that we have a vision problem. And for us to see clearly beyond the mist and the fog of hyper segregated, hyper animosity in our culture, the gospel gives us a clear lens. And so this morning, hermanos y hermanas, sisters and brothers, students and faculty, staff and administration, on this first Mondays during Mes de la Herencia Hispana, Hispanic Heritage Month, I ask you what they asked Mr. Tumnus. What time is it, and why do you see it this way? For many, it's a time of fear or dread. They see in this moment of hypertension and hyperpartisanship and the avalanche of lack of civility to one another, they see the fulfillment of that famous Harvard political philosopher Samuel Huntington in his book, The Clash of Civilizations. It is the fulfillment. It is what we expected, that when people from different civilizations get together, a clash is inevitable. As a Christian, as a person who is a prisoner of the hope of the kingdom of God, I refuse to say that it's always winter and never Christmas. I'm here to tell you on this first Mondays that as a Christian, no matter what you are going to, sister or brother, it is always Christmas. Feliz Navidad. That does not mean that there are not difficult times. That does not mean that there are not winters of our discontent. That does not mean that we don't have blizzards and snowfalls. That does not mean that there are not cultural navigations that we have to overcome. That does not mean that there are not obstacles that we need to confront. But I reject Mr. Tumnus' weather report. And I reject Dr. Huntington's thesis that when cultures get together, they need to clash. We have nothing to fear, said President Roosevelt, but fear itself. And the reason Dr. Huntington said that when you meet somebody from a different culture or a different generation, the reason he assumed that it must end in a clash, I submit to you, is because his optic was not grounded in a gospel of reconciliation. There must be, sisters and brothers, there must be a different way to see the world. Revelation chapter 7. Verse 9. John the Revelator saw it a different way. And I, John, saw a new heaven and a new earth, and a city created by God descending from heaven. And listen to what John says. I remember that some years ago I was interviewed by NPR. It was a series, I think 6 weeks or 7 series, about heaven. And they asked a rabbi, an imam, me as an evangelical pastor, a person who declared he or she was agnostic or atheist. And so there was a wide array of people talking about the afterlife. And I remember this is, in case you didn't know, when you get interviewed for television or radio or print media, they interview you for 30 minutes and they run 3 minutes. It's never the full story. But I remember the interviewer, who was a delightful man, said to me, Dr. Salguero, what would you expect hearers to hear about heaven that would surprise them? I said, you know what will surprise people, might shatter their expectation and change their vision about the afterlife? In that the afterlife, we are all still different. The interviewer was intrigued, and he said, pero ¿cómo es eso? Actually, he didn't say that. I just translated it in my head. I'm Pentecostal. I both speak and interpret tongues. Trained Reformed. Went to Reformed seminaries. I am a pneumatological person trained in Reformed theology. I am not confused. I'm integrated. He says to me, ¿Cómo es eso? How is it that we're all still different? I said, well, I submit to you John the Revelator's vision of the afterlife, of what theologians call the eschaton, the last days, the last things. John says, I saw them from every tribe, from every nation, and from every tongue. If John saw them from every tribe, nation, and tongue, the assumption is that their differences were visible. And so, I want to tell you that when all of us get to eternity, I'm still going to be brown. It will be a glorified brown, but it's still brown. And so differences are not a product of the fall. And when people try to balkanize us or dichotomize us or separate us around differences, it is because it is a fallen theology about the fall. Redundancy intended. We were not different because of the fall. God made every tree different before the fall. God made male and female before the fall. God made every species of animal and bird and things that I grew up in the King James Version. Anybody ever grow up in the King James Version with the these, the thous, and the smitifs? With everything that creepeth on the earth. And they were all different. God made every snowflake different. It still has 5 tips, but they're every different. God made the host of heaven different, seraphims and cherubims and archangels. And so when somebody tries to say to you, why can't we all be the same? Oh, God, no. I could barely deal with one of me. Difference is not a product of the fall. It is a gift of creation. And in Pentecost, it is highlighted. And in the eschaton, John says, I not only saw the difference, I celebrated the difference before the fall. So, Dr. Huntington, with all due respect, your understanding that civilizations must clash is a misreading of God's project in the world, of what Paul called ministers of reconciliation. And so, Huntington has another book. Ask me, what is it? This is an interactive crowd. You'll be Pentecostal before this thing is over. Ask me again, what is it? Huntington's second book is called Who Are We? It's not his second book, it's the second book I highlight. It is a fundamentally troubling book. It is a Chicken Little moment from a ethno-nationalist reading of American history. I appreciate much of Huntington's political theory. But in the book, Who Are We? He talks about the Hispanic arrival in America with dread and fear. And his thesis is that America is a nation of settlers, not immigrants. I respectfully disagree. America is a motley crew. It's an ensalada. It is a pupusa. It's immigrants, it's settlers, it's refugees, it's First Nations people, it's the descendants of African slaves. It is the complex milieu of the movements of people, while some were already here. And I submit to you that there was something in what Alexis de Tocqueville calls the genius of American democracy, that did not see difference as a threat or fear, but as a potentiality of a sign of a pluribus unum, of respect, of civility and pleas, beyond this kind of public virtue of tolerance. Tolerance is such a low virtue. Imagine if I invited you to my house and I say, sit in the kitchen. I tolerate you. Please have dinner with me. I tolerate you. Tolerance is such a low public virtue. The kingdom of God, the basileo totheo, has a higher virtue. It's love. Agape. Over there in the book of Hebrews, while Samuel Huntington sees fear and clash, N.T. Wright and others read Pauline theology in the New Testament theology, not as clash, but as integration. And many people are afraid because they feel that integration makes you disappear. It does not. Christianity is not an episode of Star Trek. And America is not the Borg, where resistance is futile. The dream of Dr. King was integration, not assimilation. I don't want to become you, and I don't want you to become me. I want you to be the best you can be, because God created you beautifully and wonderfully. You are a masterpiece of God. You beautiful Dutch, wonderful people. I lived in the Netherlands for a while, in Driebergen. And I worshiped at a Pinkstergemeenten church, Pentecostal. It was mostly immigrants from Africa. But there were some people who were born in the Netherlands from Haarlem and Amsterdam and Driebergen. And what I learned about this is that fear is nothing but a consequence of not seeing people correctly, of a distorted imago Dei. That what Paul says about the ministry of reconciliation is nothing else than seeing the other. The writer of the book of Hebrews says, remember hospitality. The Greek word for hospitality, xenophilia. Xenophilia. Love of the stranger. Look at this. Look at me. I am your brother. But if the culture narratives, the distorted gospel that you and I have digested alienate us from each other, it is no gospel at all. It is idolatry. It is the failure of Huntington to see clearly. And when you cannot see clearly, as John Cena says before he leg drops his opponent, you can't see me. I speak in tongues. I speak academies and WWE. Sisters and brothers, I am concerned that we are living in despair because we cannot see correctly. And when you cannot see correctly, despair sets in. You see monsters under the bed, and monsters in the closet, and monsters in the border, and monsters in the Republican Party, and monsters in the Democrat Party. You see monsters where there are none. And sometimes there are some. Despair is a product of not seeing clearly. Number 2, deceit. Deceit is when you transact a lie for the truth. Deceit is powerfully subtle because it poses half-truths as the entire truth. Deceit is when you and I drink more deeply from another well that is not the gospel. Deceit is when we have idols where we put before the gospel and before our Christ. When we put partisanship or nationalism or ethnocentrism or privilege or hate or racism or xenophobia or sexism. Deceit is subtle because it is not a direct lie. It is the truth masked as a lie. I'm reminded that in this moment of John Steinbeck's book, The Winter of Our Discontent, Ethan Allen Hawley, the protagonist, he has a decision to make. He has to decide whether he will surrender to the echelons of power, deceit, to this kind of Nietzschean will to power, this ambition to be the top, to hold power, or will he surrender to integrity? His discontent was not with society solely, but with his inability to respond to a society in change. What is the antidote, hermanos y hermanas, to deceit? The antidote to deceit is insight. The Spanish word perspicacia, in English translated perspicacity, the capacity to see the thing for what it really is, not what people imagine it to be, not what people distort it to be, for what it really is. The scripture writer tells us there's a way to avoid despair, which is produced from deceit. In all you're getting, get the understanding. Don't just seek to be understood, which is important, but seek to understand. Look at me. Who am I? What do I represent? Am I a threat or a promise? Look at me. Am I your ally or your foe? Mírame, mírame. Am I a glorious future or dystopic dread? What do you see? Winter or Christmas? Deceit has a way of beguiling me to think that just because it's winter, Christmas can never come. Christmas is the through line. It is what Dietrich Bonhoeffer calls the cantus firmus, the strong song in the winters of our discontent. I am years old. I look 27, but I'm a little older than that. And I was born in a suburb of Puerto Rico called New Jersey. I am a Jersey Rican. I have in my life experienced microaggressions, experienced racism. I've also experienced privilege of my maleness and my education, my authority as a religious figure. I have experienced both disenfranchisement and privilege. And the question is, how do I embody all of those realities of who I am in this moment in America so that I continue to promote Christmas even when most people say it's winter? Some years ago, I read the book by Coates, Ta-Nehisi Coates. He had a lot to say in his powerful narrative. He begins to underscore the microaggressions and the direct aggressions. Allow me to quote Mr. Coates about his existential fear. Quote, "To be black in the Baltimore of my youth was to be naked before the elements of the world, before all the guns and fists and knives, crack, rape, and disease. The nakedness is not an error, nor pathology. The nakedness is the correct and intended result of policy, the predictable upshot of people forced for centuries to live under fear. Fear distorts your reality. There are legitimate fears and unfounded fears. And then I read about the fear of hunger in Appalachia, where small children are drinking from baby bottles, but they're not drinking milk, they're not drinking water, they're drinking Mountain Dew. Rots their teeth. And that fear produces an anxiety that makes people say it is winter and never Christmas. But I have a different way of seeing the world. I have a different lens through which to see the world. It is called the gospel. And the gospel is not a utopic illusion, but it is hope-filled. Zechariah, the 9th chapter, says, to those who return from the exile, I write to all of you, prisoners of hope. Prisoners of hope. It is only como un cautivo de la esperanza que usted y yo podemos ver la Navidad en el medio de nuestro invierno. I will not translate. So just for a brief moment, some of you may be able to experience what it is to hear and not understand. Fear, deceit, the antidotes of insight and purpose, scarcity. For the gospel is the lens that allows us to see the things for what they really are. That those refugees, those immigrants, those Republicans, those Democrats, those independents, they are not your enemy. They are your sister. They are your brother. Look at me. What do you see? And so this morning, as I speak to you during these first Mondays, I have some antidotes for the threats of despair and fear and deceit. To each of you here at Dordt College who have the boldness, audacity, and humility to invite a Jersey Rican into Iowa in the middle of a rainfall. Will you be able to see differently? Sisters and brothers, we are the ones the world is waiting for to put on a different set of lenses, gospel lenses, that in the place of fear, they put love. Love is the highest of Christian virtues. Love, to quote St. Augustine, is the summa bonum. It is the highest good. Several years ago, I was called for a discussion at the Department of Justice. The discussion at the Department of Justice was about men of color and law enforcement. It was about 300 people. Half the room was law enforcement. The other half of the room were men of color, African American, Latino, First Nations or indigenous people, Asian, so forth and so on. And one of the panels were faith leaders. And they said to us, we want faith leaders to come in because you're one of the few people who have both people in your congregation at the same time. So in the congregation that I serve, I have sheriffs and state troopers and police officers from Orlando Police Department, and I have people who work for the Department of Homeland Security. And that same church of close to 5,000 people created in the image of God, I have undocumented immigrants, and I have DACA recipients, and I have African American and Haitian young men and Latino. And the convener said to us from the Department of Justice, is there anything in that convening, in that Sunday morning gathering that allows these people to be together and when they greet each other and pass the peace of Christ, they see each other not as the label police officer or immigrant, but as brother and sister? I said, yes. Love. Love is, I'm not talking about some sentimentality. Love is a decision. You remember Anna Mae? Ask me, who's Anna Mae? Ask me again, who's Anna Mae? Anna Mae is Tina Turner. And Tina Turner wrote a song. It's very prophetic. What's love got to do? Oh, what's love got to do? Got to do, got to do with it. Oh, what's love but a second-hand emotion? The reason Tina asked the question about love is because she had been for quite some time a victim of domestic abuse. And when you have been abused, you ask the love question. And when you've been misinterpreted, you ask the love question. And when you are afraid, you ask the love question. Sisters and brothers, the antidote to fear is not courage, it's love. Love casts away all fear. What is love? Love is a decision that you will respect the image of God in the other, no matter how different or how the same. Love needs to become a public virtue. It allows you to see me and for me to see you. It allows us to eschew facile caricatures and depictions of one another. The reason we are in despair is because fear is at an all-time high, and love is in high demand and low supply. Love is at the center of the Christian evangel and the Christian gospel. Love cost Christ his life. Love is sacrificial. For Corinthians 13 says, love understands all things, forgives all things. Love seeks not its own things. It is never jealous. Love is free of pride. That's ethnic pride, racial pride, gender pride. Love never fails. I know it's difficult to talk about love in a time where we reduce people's thoughts to 140 characters and now a little more. I know it's difficult to talk about love when we are often tempted to go to our own corners of fear, whether it's Ta-Nehisi Coates' postmodern nihilism or Samuel Huntington's postmodern ethno-nationalism. But you, sisters and brothers, can move us beyond despair with love. What the world needs now, said the songwriter, is love. Sweet love. And the second thing we need is truth. Jesus says in John 8, and you shall know the truth, and the truth os hará libre, shall make you free. What is truth? Pontius Pilate asked Jesus. Truth is to see the thing for what it is, to experience the texture, the sentiment, the history. Truth is not just what you see at the moment. Truth is tied to history. When you suffer from historical amnesia, you do not have the whole truth. When you're sworn to give a deposition, they say, will you say the truth? The whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And so as a group of us came to the Department of Justice, where we spoke to law enforcement and where we spoke to men, young men of color, there was something in common that we began with. I said to all of them, you are all loved. When your wife or husband kisses you on your way out, fear that you may not come back, it's rooted in a love that wants to keep you close. When your mother and your father tell you to keep your hands at 3 and 9 o'clock, lest any movement be misinterpreted as an aggression, it is rooted in love that wants to keep you close. Isn't it interesting that both of you are having conversations rooted in love that somehow get distorted into enemy? We are at a moment here in Iowa, here at Christian colleges around the country, here in the United States of America where we will have to decide, do we believe in winter more than Christmas, or in Christmas more than winter? Will we see in a lonely manger not the threat to Herod, but the Messiah of the world? Will we see in poor shepherd boys, nomads, people without a home? Will we see proclaimers of a new truth and a new world? Or we will see the downfall of the Pax Romana? What time is it? Perhaps it's time to see. Oh, say, can you see that the gospel will have the last word? And although people think it's always winter, remind Mr. Tumnus that with courage and love, Christmas is always present. Mr. and Mrs. Beaver had a conversation with Lucy, and Lucy asked them about Aslan. And Lucy said, "Is Aslan safe? Is he safe?" Mr. and Mrs. Beaver said, "Oh, no. Safe? Safe to love people beyond your boundaries? Safe to see people who may strike fear in your heart? Safe? He's a lion." Lions are not safe. The gospel is not safe. But they add, he is good. Sisters and brothers, Merry Christmas. Feliz Navidad. Push beyond despair with love and courage. Amen.